My husband set fire to our restaurant, and instead of hating him for it, I found myself grateful. That blaze didn't just destroy a building. It exposed secrets buried in the ashes and set off a chain of events that ended up saving our lives in ways I never expected. The night our dream restaurant burned to the ground, with 300 guests waiting for their tables, my husband looked me in the eye amidst the sirens and smoke and said, "We need to get out of here before they figure out I started the fire." My world didn't just stop spinning. It shattered. One minute I was pulling up, excited to see our grand opening unfold, and the next our entire life's work was a blazing inferno. As he got into my car, his words hit me like a physical blow. I screamed, the sound tearing through the chaos, telling him he'd just destroyed 20 years of our lives, our daughter's college funds, everything. Smoke poured into the night sky, thick and suffocating, mirroring the despair rising in my chest. Outside, behind police tape, 300 people who had reservations watched, some crying, some shouting as firefighters battled the blaze. We'd poured every last penny, taken out a second mortgage, worked 18-hour days for 6 months straight to build that place. Now it was gone because he'd lost his mind. Parents shielded their kids from the heat, more sirens wailed, and as we drove away from the inferno he'd created, I vowed I'd never, ever forgive him for obliterating our future. Once we were home, the silence in the car was deafening, but then he finally spoke, his voice trembling. "Inspector Harris has been taking bribes," he confessed, pulling out his phone. The screen flashed with images that made my stomach churn. Photos of diseased meat, 300 pounds of steaks and chicken, covered in dark spots, green edges, yellow patches rotting even through the plastic. He showed me texts he'd sent Harris, begging him to condemn the shipment. But Harris had brushed him off, said the meat was fine, and threatened to revoke our permits if we caused trouble on opening night. My husband spent 2 frantic hours calling other restaurants using the same supplier. What he uncovered was a nightmare. Mass food poisoning incidents, all covered up by Harris, who blamed kitchen procedures. A 6-year-old girl named Mia was in the ICU, kidney failure, 60% of her liver gone. A pregnant woman lost her baby after a birthday party where a dozen people got sick, but Harris wrote it up as improper storage, ignoring temperature logs that proved otherwise. 17 customers hospitalized after a wedding, the groom nearly dying of sepsis, and Harris threatened to shut the place down if they went to the media. Then the smoking gun. An envelope, photographed from the delivery truck, full of checks from the supplier, made out to Harris personally for $5,000, marked consultation fees. Each date matched an inspection. The supplier was selling contaminated meat from a processing plant where refrigeration had failed for a week during a heat wave. Instead of destroying the inventory, they were mixing rotten product with fresh, thinking no one would die immediately. Harris's boss was getting even bigger payments, part of a sprawling network across 3 counties, where inspectors passed anything for the right price. My husband had called everyone: the FDA, the state health department, the attorney general's office, even the FBI. But without an active outbreak, no one could override local jurisdiction. By Monday, when federal offices reopened, 300 people would have already eaten that poison. But then he looked at me, his hands shaking even harder, and said, "That's not even why I burned it down." He showed me another text. It was from the supplier's owner, sent just 2 hours before opening. It said if he caused any problems or refused to serve the meat, they knew where our daughters went to school, what time they walked home. They knew Olivia had violin practice on Tuesdays. Ava had soccer on Thursdays behind the old warehouse. They said, accidents happen to families that don't understand how business works, and casually mentioned another restaurant owner, who tried to report them, had his son hit by a car that was never found. My husband realized we weren't dealing with corrupt businessmen. We were dealing with actual criminals. They were threatening to hurt our children if we didn't poison 300 innocent people. And that's when he knew. He had to burn it all down. I held him in our kitchen, his body racked with shakes, as the horrific truth finally sank in. He hadn't destroyed our future out of spite or madness. He had sacrificed everything to protect our daughters, and 300 strangers who would never know how close they came to dying. He'd even been smart about it, starting the fire in the grease trap so it would look accidental, making sure all the contaminated meat burned with everything else. The news was already reporting it as a kitchen accident on opening night, And the firefighters had told reporters these things happen with new restaurants. We sat there utterly lost, knowing we'd lost everything material. But our girls were safe. And nobody would be planning funerals tomorrow. Then a knock at the door. "We need to talk," Harris said, stepping into our doorway. We both jumped. We hadn't heard him approach. He was wearing a fire department jacket, an investigation kit in his hand. "I volunteer weekends with the fire investigation unit," he drawled, a sickening smile playing on his lips. "Helps me stay connected to the community I serve." He pulled out an official notebook, clicked his pen, and that smile stretched wider. "Now let's talk about how this fire really started." He stepped into our kitchen without waiting for an invitation, setting his heavy investigation kit on our counter with a thud that rattled the coffee mugs. My husband's whole body went rigid next to me, and I felt my legs turn to water. Harris's smile stretched wider as he looked between us, and I knew right then. He knew exactly what my husband had done. The fear hit me so hard I couldn't breathe, my chest getting tight. Harris pulled out a chair and made himself comfortable at our kitchen table. I forced myself to take a breath and managed to say we weren't expecting anyone tonight. My voice came out steadier than I felt as I asked if he could wait in the hallway for just a minute, since we needed to process everything that had happened. My husband backed me up, his hand finding mine under the table, saying we just needed a moment after losing everything. Harris tilted his head and studied us for what felt like forever before standing up slowly. "Sure, take your time," he said, but his eyes promised this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He walked to our hallway, leaving his kit on the counter like he was marking his territory, and I heard him whistling some jaunty tune while he waited. The second he was out of sight, my husband and I leaned close and whispered fast about what to do. We couldn't run because the girls were upstairs sleeping, and we couldn't leave them. We couldn't fight Harris directly since he had all the power here. We definitely couldn't admit anything, or we'd both end up in prison. My husband's hands were shaking as he whispered that we had to say nothing beyond the absolute minimum. Just basic facts and nothing more. I nodded and squeezed his hand before calling Harris back in. Keeping my voice casual like this was just a normal visit. When he came back, I stayed standing and didn't offer him a seat or coffee or anything that would make him feel welcome. I kept myself between him and the stairs where our daughters slept, positioning us near the door like we were ready for him to leave. Harris pulled out his notebook and clicked his pen, then started asking where we were before the fire started. Each question felt like a trap ready to snap shut on us. He wanted to know the exact time we left the restaurant, who saw us leave, whether we had any enemies who might want to hurt our business. My husband stayed quiet while I gave short answers about being home getting ready for opening night. Harris asked if anyone could verify that, and I mentioned calling my mom earlier, but couldn't remember the exact time. He wrote everything down in his little book, and I knew he was writing lies because nothing I said mattered to him. Then Harris mentioned how convenient it was that all that contaminated meat burned up along with any evidence of health violations. My husband's jaw got so tight I thought his teeth might crack, but he didn't say a word. I kept my voice flat and said we didn't know anything about contaminated meat, that all our supplies came from licensed vendors. Harris smiled at that and made another note, then asked if we'd had any disputes with suppliers recently. I said, "No, everything was normal, just opening night stress like any new restaurant." He kept pushing, asking about our insurance coverage, whether we'd increased it recently, if we had any money problems. Each question made my stomach twist tighter, but I kept my answers short and boring. Before he finally headed for the door, Harris turned and said investigators would need to interview us separately tomorrow morning at 9 sharp. He suggested we both remember things correctly, his voice getting harder on those words. Then he added that fire investigation could lead to serious charges, including arson, which carried up to 20 years in prison in our state. He let that hang in the air for a moment before adding that insurance fraud was federal, which meant even more time. The threat sat heavy in the room even after I closed the door behind him and turned both locks. We stood frozen for a minute, listening to his car start outside, before we both rushed upstairs to check on Olivia and Ava. They were still sleeping peacefully in their beds, Olivia with her stuffed elephant and Ava spread out like a starfish. My husband grabbed his phone and started downloading some doorbell camera app, while I went room to room checking every window lock. He got the app working and showed me how we could see the front door and get alerts if anyone came close. The timing of Harris showing up at our house right after the fire seemed awfully convenient, didn't it? I'm still curious how he even knew where we lived or that we'd be home instead of still at the scene. I tested the locks on the girls' windows twice, making sure they couldn't open more than 3 inches. Neither of us even tried to sleep that night, taking turns sitting in the chair by our bedroom window, watching the street. Every car that passed made us both jump, and twice we thought we saw someone in the shadows, but it was just trees moving. At 3 in the morning, I opened my laptop and started searching for lawyers who handled both criminal defense and whistleblower cases. Most law firms wouldn't open until 9, but I made a list anyway, reading reviews and checking their case histories. My husband sat next to me, pointing out which ones had experience with corruption cases. We found Janice Goodwin, who advertised a 24-hour emergency line for urgent situations. Her website said she'd handled cases against dirty cops and government officials before. I saved her number in my phone but decided to wait until regular hours to call, since we didn't want to seem desperate. Dawn came with neither of us having slept even 10 minutes, and we were still sitting at the kitchen table, taking turns watching the street. My husband's hands shook so bad making coffee that he spilled grounds all over the counter. I got out a notebook and started writing down everything we could remember about Harris's threats and what the supplier's owner had said on the phone. We needed to document every detail before our memories got fuzzy from no sleep and stress. My husband added times and dates to everything, using his phone to check when calls had come in. By 7:30, we had 3 pages of notes that we'd give to whatever lawyer we hired. Getting the girls ready for school felt like acting in a play where we pretended everything was normal. I made their usual breakfast while my husband packed their lunches, both of us forcing smiles. When I dropped them off, I made sure to walk them all the way to their classroom doors instead of the usual curb drop-off. I told both teachers that only my husband or I would be picking them up, no exceptions, and to please keep them inside during recess today. The teachers could tell something was wrong, but didn't push when I said we'd had a family emergency. Back home, we spread all our financial papers across the kitchen table, and the reality hit like a punch to the gut. The second mortgage payment was due in 5 days, and we had exactly 2 months of savings if we were careful. The restaurant insurance wouldn't pay anything until the fire investigation closed, which could take months, according to what I'd read online. We'd have to sell one of the cars just to make next month's bills. The numbers made me feel sick, seeing 20 years of saving and planning reduced to a pile of bills we couldn't pay. My husband grabbed his car keys and said we needed to get out of the house to make the call. We drove to the grocery store parking lot 3 miles away and parked in the back corner where nobody else was around. I dialed Janice Goodwin's number from my phone while my husband watched the parking lot for anyone following us. She answered on the second ring, and I told her everything about the fire and Harris showing up at our house. My husband leaned close to the phone, adding details about the contaminated meat and the threats against our daughters. Janice listened without interrupting for 20 minutes while we explained the whole messy situation. When we finished, she told us to come to her office right away and gave us the address downtown. Her voice stayed calm, but I could hear the urgency underneath. We drove straight there, checking the mirrors every few seconds to make sure nobody was behind us. The law office was on the 10th floor of an old building with good security and cameras everywhere. Janice met us in the lobby herself instead of sending a secretary, which made me feel like she was taking this seriously. Her office had thick walls and heavy doors that made it feel like the first safe place we'd been since the fire. She explained attorney-client privilege meant everything we told her was protected, and nobody could force her to reveal it. My husband showed her all the photos on his phone while she took pages of notes in neat handwriting. She said we needed to preserve all the evidence and make backup copies of everything immediately. The most important thing was to say nothing to any investigators without her present, no matter what they threatened. She agreed to represent us for a retainer that would drain most of our remaining savings, but we didn't have a choice. That afternoon, I used the burner phone Janice gave us to call Naomi Kim, whose number I found online. She'd exposed corruption at the Port Authority last year, and won some journalism award for it. I only gave her basic details about contaminated meat and corrupt inspectors without using any names. She was interested, but said she needed documentation before she could move forward with any story. I told her I'd be in touch once we figured out what was safe to share. An hour later, my husband's phone rang with a call from Tristan Marshall at the Attorney General's office. He was returning my husband's tip from yesterday about the supplier and wanted to know more. He said our information fit a pattern they'd been tracking across multiple counties for months. Tristan wanted to meet, but only in a secure location with specific protocols for safety. My husband put him on speaker so Janice could hear, and she approved the meeting with conditions about immunity. The next call came from Fire Captain Jeff Ainsworth, who needed to schedule the official fire investigation review. He said it would be tomorrow morning at 9 and we'd need to walk through what happened. Then he mentioned it was unusual for Harris to be involved, since he wasn't regular fire department personnel. Jeff sounded confused about why a health inspector was part of the fire investigation team. This gave us a tiny bit of hope that maybe not everyone was corrupt. We drove to the girls' school and met with Aubrey Chavez in her office while classes were in session. I explained we'd had some threats related to my husband's business without going into details about the fire. We created new pickup passwords that only my husband and I would know for getting the girls. The drop-off times got shifted by 15 minutes, and the teachers would keep them inside during recess for now. Aubrey was wonderful about not asking too many questions while still taking our concerns seriously. She promised to personally watch the girls during school hours and alert us to anything unusual. After that, we drove to what was left of our restaurant to meet the insurance adjuster. The building was a black skeleton with yellow tape around it, and the smell of smoke still thick in the air. The adjuster took hundreds of photos and measured everything while making notes on her tablet. She said the claim was frozen pending the cause determination, which could take weeks or months to resolve. Our financial cushion just got even thinner, since we couldn't access any insurance money yet. We got home around 6, and I was making sandwiches when Harris knocked on our door again. He claimed he forgot to ask some questions during his first visit and needed clarification on timing. My husband slipped his phone in his pocket with the recording app already running before we let Harris in. Harris stood in our doorway and implied that talking to reporters or investigators would be dangerous for everyone involved. He said fires had a way of spreading to other properties when people didn't cooperate with investigations. His tone made it clear this was a threat, even though his words stayed vague enough to avoid anything illegal. My husband kept his responses short while I stood behind him, trying not to shake with anger. Harris finally left after 10 minutes, but we knew he'd be back to keep pressuring us. The next day we followed Janice's protocol for meeting Tristan at the mall food court downtown. We got there early and bought food we didn't want just to blend in with the lunch crowd. Tristan showed up in regular clothes, looking like any other shopper grabbing a quick meal. We pretended to bump into each other near the trash cans where the security cameras had a blind spot. My hand shook as I passed him the folder with copies of all our evidence. He slipped it into his shopping bag and walked away without saying anything while we stayed to finish our food. Later that afternoon, Naomi called to say she'd been connecting with other restaurant owners in the area. 3 of them had customers who got sick after eating meat from the same supplier we'd used. She introduced us to them on a conference call, and their stories made my stomach turn. One owner talked about Mia, who was still in the ICU, fighting for her life after eating at his restaurant. Her parents were spending every day at the hospital watching their little girl suffer from kidney failure. Another owner described a pregnant woman who lost her baby after eating contaminated chicken at a birthday party. These weren't just numbers or statistics anymore, but real families whose lives got destroyed. Hearing their voices crack as they talked about feeling guilty for serving the poisoned food made me cry. They all said Harris had threatened them if they went public and covered up the real cause of the poisonings. The supplier had been operating like this for over a year with Harris's protection. By the time we hung up, I understood my husband had saved 300 families from joining this nightmare. Jeff called the next morning while we were making breakfast, his voice careful as he explained the preliminary findings. The fire had started exactly where my husband planned it, in the grease trap system near the kitchen's back wall. No chemical accelerants showed up in the initial tests, which was good news for us. He mentioned they were still waiting on lab results from samples taken at different burn points throughout the restaurant. Something in his tone made me grip the phone tighter as he described inconsistencies in Harris's report. Harris had written that the fire pattern suggested arson, but couldn't explain how without evidence of accelerants. Jeff said he'd keep us updated and hung up before I could ask more questions. That afternoon, we sat in Janice's office while she laid out folders on her desk, showing what would happen if charges got filed. She walked us through each step using simple words that still made my stomach turn. First would come the arrest, probably at our house with neighbors watching everything, then booking at the county jail with fingerprints and photos that would end up online forever. Bail would be set based on the charges, maybe $50,000 or more for arson. The trial could take months or even a year to start while we waited and worried. She was already working on a defense strategy based on necessity and duress from the threats. My husband's face went pale as she explained he could face 5 to 10 years in prison if convicted. His hands started shaking again, and I grabbed them under the table to steady him. We left her office feeling sick, trying to process that my husband might actually go to jail for saving lives. The parking garage felt darker than usual. As we walked to our car in silence, I noticed a dark sedan pull out behind us as we exited onto the main street. The same car stayed 3 vehicles back as we drove to the grocery store for milk and bread. My husband watched the mirrors while I pretended to look at my phone, but really took photos of the license plate. The sedan followed us all the way home, parking down the street when we pulled into our driveway. We went inside quickly and called 911 from the kitchen while watching through the blinds. The operator took our report and said they'd send a patrol car to check the area. 20 minutes later, a police car drove slowly past, but the sedan had already left by then. The officer knocked on our door and took our statement, saying they'd increase patrols, but we both knew that meant nothing. Naomi called that evening with news that made my hands shake with fresh anger. She'd gotten copies of canceled checks from the supplier to Harris through a source at the bank. Each check was for exactly $5,000. Marked as consultation fees in neat handwriting. The dates matched perfectly with inspections where Harris had passed contaminated meat shipments. Seeing the actual proof of what he'd been doing for money made me want to scream. These weren't just numbers but evidence of him selling out families like ours for cash. She emailed encrypted copies to Janice and said her source could testify if needed. The next day, Tristan called, asking my husband to provide a sworn statement about the threats to our daughters. We met him at Janice's office, where she helped craft language that told the truth, but stayed legally careful. My husband had to describe the phone call from the supplier's owner in detail. He explained how they knew about Olivia's violin practice and Ava's soccer schedule. His voice cracked when he repeated their words about accidents happening to families who didn't cooperate. Janice typed while he talked, stopping to adjust phrases that could be problematic later. The final statement was 3 pages describing the threats without admitting to the fire directly. My husband's hand shook so badly when he signed it that his signature looked different from usual. Tristan took the original and gave us a copy for our records before leaving quickly. 2 days later, we were getting the girls ready for school when everything changed again. My husband went to check the mail while I braided Ava's hair in the kitchen. He came back holding a plain white envelope with no postage or return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with 2 typed words that made my blood freeze. Stay quiet was all it said. But below that was Ava's soccer schedule and Olivia's violin times. I grabbed my phone to call Janice while my husband called the school to verify the girls' schedules hadn't been accessed. The principal said their records were secure, but we didn't believe it anymore. Janice answered on the second ring and immediately told us to pack bags for a few days. She had a motel her firm used for witnesses who needed temporary protection from threats. We threw clothes and toiletries into suitcases while telling the girls it was a surprise adventure. They were excited about staying in a motel with a pool, not knowing the real reason we had to leave. The motel was 40 minutes away in a different county, paid for with Janice's corporate card to avoid traces. Our room had 2 double beds, a small table, and a kitchenette with a microwave and mini fridge. The girls bounced on the beds while we checked the locks and pulled the curtains closed tight. From the motel, we kept the girls' routines as normal as possible to avoid scaring them. Each morning we took different routes to their school, doubling back and watching for anyone following us. Janice's investigator checked our house daily, collecting mail and making sure nothing was disturbed. Living out of suitcases felt strange, but safer than being home where they knew to find us. The girls did homework at the wobbly motel table, while we cooked simple dinners in the tiny kitchen. Jeff filed an official memo with his supervisors about Harris's conflict of interest. The next week, He documented how Harris had inspected our restaurant multiple times before investigating the fire. His supervisor agreed this was inappropriate and limited Harris's involvement in the case going forward. It was a small victory, but we celebrated quietly in our cramped motel room that night. Meanwhile, Naomi kept working on her story, piecing together a timeline that showed the poisoning started months before our fire. She found records of emergency room visits that matched dates when restaurants received meat shipments. Her editor wanted to run the story, but needed sources willing to go on record. She understood why we couldn't go public yet, with the investigation still active and threats still coming. Still, she kept digging through health department records and interviewing victims who didn't know the real cause of their illness. The frustration in her voice when she called us was obvious, having all this proof of corruption and poisoning, but no way to warn the public because of legal fears. Then, someone made an anonymous call to Child Protective Services claiming we were endangering our kids by keeping them in unstable housing and exposing them to criminal activity. The social worker showed up at the motel the next morning, and we called Aubrey immediately to help us navigate the interview. She coached us by phone on what to say while the social worker looked around our small room, talked to the girls about their routines, and checked that they had proper food and clothing. The girls were clearly healthy and happy, doing homework at the table and laughing about a funny video. So the social worker marked it as an unfounded complaint, but we knew the harassment was escalating. Janice spent the next week negotiating with prosecutors for limited immunity on my husband's testimony about the corruption and threats. Though arson charges would still remain possible, depending on the fire investigation outcome. The deal wasn't perfect since it only covered testimony about the supplier and Harris, not the fire itself, but it protected him from the worst outcomes like conspiracy charges that could mean 20 years in prison. We signed the agreement in Janice's office with hands shaking, knowing we were committed now to testifying against dangerous people who'd already threatened our children. 5 days later, Jeff called with the lab results showing no chemical accelerants anywhere in the restaurant, and the burn pattern was completely consistent with a grease trap fire spreading naturally through kitchen ventilation. The official cause was listed as undetermined, since they couldn't prove whether the grease trap ignited accidentally or deliberately, which meant no arson charges could be filed without additional evidence that didn't exist. 2 days later, Tristan called us back to his office where he'd spread shipping records across the conference table like a giant puzzle. He'd been tracking deliveries for weeks and discovered the supplier wasn't just selling bad meat to our area, but running a label switching operation across 3 whole counties. The boxes would arrive at one warehouse with dates showing the meat was expired, then leave the same warehouse with fresh dates printed on new labels. He showed us photos of trucks making stops at printing shops between deliveries, places that specialized in food packaging materials. The receipts he'd gotten through subpoenas showed orders for thousands of date stickers matching exactly what appeared on contaminated shipments. More inspectors were involved than just Harris and his boss, with at least 6 others taking payments to look the other way when restaurants reported problems. Tristan was building what he called a RICO case, which meant they could charge everyone as part of organized crime instead of just individual corruption. The scale of it made my stomach turn, because hundreds of restaurants had been serving this poison without knowing it. Janice called the next morning saying she'd arranged for my husband to meet Harris while wearing a recording device. Our state allowed recording if one person knew about it, which meant we could legally capture whatever Harris said. The meeting would happen at a coffee shop downtown where Harris liked to conduct his side business away from official buildings. My husband spent the whole night before practicing what to say, going over Janice's script until the words sounded natural. She'd written responses for every possible direction the conversation might go, making sure he wouldn't accidentally say something that could hurt our case. I watched him pace our motel room, repeating phrases about being confused by the fire investigation and wanting to understand the process better. His hands shook as he buttoned the shirt that would hide the tiny recorder Janice had gotten from the state police. The coffee shop was busy when we arrived separately, me sitting 3 tables away, pretending to work on my laptop while my husband waited for Harris. Harris showed up 20 minutes late, wearing civilian clothes and carrying a folder that he set between them like a barrier. He started talking about how investigations could go different ways depending on what people remembered, and how memories could change over time. He mentioned that paperwork sometimes got lost or misfiled, especially when departments were busy with bigger cases. The way he leaned forward and lowered his voice made it clear these weren't innocent observations, but offers to make our problems disappear. My husband stuck to Janice's script, asking general questions about timelines and procedures without agreeing to anything. Harris got more direct, saying that people who understood how the system worked usually had better outcomes than those who made waves. He talked about a restaurant owner from last year whose place burned down, and how that man had avoided serious charges by being cooperative and not talking to reporters or investigators from other departments. The recording device captured every word, even though Harris never directly said he'd fix things for money or threatened us explicitly. After Harris left, we met Janice at her office where she played back the recording and smiled at how perfectly it showed his pattern of corruption without him realizing he'd been caught. That afternoon, Naomi called with a warning that made everything scarier. She'd been digging into the suppliers' connections and noticed they seemed to know about investigations before they became official. Someone in the Attorney General's office might be feeding them information, because 3 different times when Tristan had planned operations, the targets had cleaned up evidence just before warrants were served. She suggested we be careful about what information went through official channels and maybe keep some things just between us and lawyers we trusted. The paranoia was getting to all of us, making us check for cars following us and avoid talking on phones we hadn't bought with cash. Tristan's solution was to bring in someone from internal affairs he'd known for 15 years, a woman who specialized in corruption cases and had never had a leak. They opened what he called a sealed probe, which meant only 5 people in the entire state knew about it. The investigation finally felt like it had momentum instead of us just collecting evidence that might never matter. A week later, the formal fire interview got scheduled at the municipal building with Harris trying to take the lead. Despite Jeff's objections that he shouldn't be involved, Janice insisted on being present and brought a court reporter to make an official transcript of everything said. The conference room felt too small with all of us around the table, Harris glaring at the court reporter like she was personally insulting him. He started with leading questions designed to make my husband admit to being near the kitchen when the fire started. My husband stuck to exactly what Janice had prepared, saying he couldn't speculate about things he didn't witness and refusing to answer hypothetical questions. Every time Harris pushed harder, my husband would look at Janice, who'd remind Harris that witnesses weren't required to guess or imagine scenarios. I watched my husband stay calm even when Harris raised his voice and slammed his hand on the table, demanding real answers. The court reporter typed every word, including Harris's outbursts and Janice's objections to his inappropriate conduct. Jeff finally stepped in after 2 hours, declaring the interview over since Harris was badgering the witness instead of conducting a professional investigation. He pulled out forms and started documenting Harris's behavior, writing down specific violations of department protocol and conflicts of interest. Harris stood up so fast his chair fell over, pointing at Jeff and saying, "This wasn't over," before storming out. Jeff finished his report and submitted it to both the fire department and the state oversight board that afternoon. 3 days later, I was loading groceries when a man appeared beside my car, standing way too close and blocking me from closing the trunk. He said my daughters had pretty names, mentioning Olivia and Ava like he knew them personally. His breath smelled like cigarettes, and his eyes never left mine. As he talked about how dangerous parking lots could be for families who didn't watch their surroundings, I managed to stay calm enough to memorize his face while my phone recorded video from my pocket. When he finally walked away, I got his license plate and called 911 from inside my locked car. The responding officer took it seriously, especially after I explained our situation with the supplier and showed him the video. He called for backup, and they found the man 2 blocks away, though he claimed he'd just been making friendly conversation. The officer filed a report and said they'd increase patrols around the grocery store and our motel. The next morning, a judge signed orders approving surveillance and a wire for my husband to wear to a meeting with someone from the supplier's company. The task force spent hours planning the operation, choosing a location they could control and having backup teams ready if something went wrong. They picked the delivery yard where trucks loaded meat for distribution, because it was isolated enough for privacy, but open enough for surveillance teams to watch everything. My husband would meet with a mid-level executive who'd been nervous about the investigation, according to phone taps the FBI had been running. The plan was to get him talking about the operation and maybe flip him to testify against his bosses. The net was finally closing around these people who'd poisoned kids like Mia and threatened our daughters. The next morning, my husband spent 4 hours in a conference room with undercover officers who taught him hand signals for if things went bad and phrases that would trigger backup to move in. They made him practice saying specific words to get the supplier rep talking about money and threats without it sounding like entrapment, running through different scenarios until his responses sounded natural. The officer showed him where to stand so the wire would pick up everything clearly, and how to position his body so the camera in his shirt button would catch the rep's face. We practiced at home that night with me playing the supplier rep, throwing different responses at him until he could handle anything without freezing up. The meeting was set for tomorrow afternoon at 3 at the delivery yard, where trucks loaded meat for restaurants across the county. I barely slept that night, thinking about everything that could go wrong, checking on the girls every hour to make sure they were safe in their beds. My husband left at noon the next day to get wired up while I waited in a surveillance van 3 blocks from the yard with 2 officers monitoring the feeds. The supplier rep showed up 10 minutes early in a black SUV, checking his phone while my husband walked across the gravel lot, looking calmer than I felt watching through the grainy camera feed. They shook hands and the rep immediately started talking about how unfortunate the fire was, saying, "These things happen when people don't understand how business works in this city." My husband guided the conversation toward the meat quality, mentioning other restaurants had gotten sick customers, and the rep laughed, saying Harris made sure those reports never went anywhere official. The rep pulled out an envelope and said there was $5,000 inside for my husband to keep quiet about what he knew, plus another $5,000 every month if he agreed to use their supplier at his next restaurant. When my husband asked about the threats to our daughters, the rep said that was just business talk to make sure everyone stayed reasonable. But accidents did happen to families who caused problems for his boss. The task force moved in fast. For unmarked cars boxing in the SUV while officers surrounded the rep with guns drawn. They had him face down on the gravel in seconds while my husband backed away with his hands visible so nobody would mistake him for a threat. I watched them load the rep into a police car while evidence techs bagged the envelope in his phone, finally letting myself believe we might actually win this fight. 3 hours later, state troopers knocked on Harris's door while he was trying to delete files from his phone and laptop. Jeff had flagged Harris's suspicious behavior to investigators that morning after Harris tried to access sealed fire reports he shouldn't have known existed. They caught Harris shoving a bag of cash and documents into his fireplace, but the papers were still readable enough to show payments from multiple suppliers over the past 2 years. Seeing Harris in handcuffs on the 11 o'clock news felt unreal after everything he'd put us through. Naomi's story hit the newspaper website at midnight with photos of the contaminated meat, copies of the checks to Harris, and statements from 17 victims, including Mia's parents. By morning, 3 more restaurants came forward saying they'd been threatened into silence about bad meat, and 2 former health inspectors admitted they'd quit rather than participate in the corruption. Our phone rang nonstop with reporters wanting comments, but Janice handled everything, releasing a carefully worded statement that protected us legally while supporting the investigation. The Attorney General held a press conference that afternoon announcing charges against 12 people, including Harris, 3 supplier executives, and 2 other inspectors who'd taken bribes. More inspectors were suspended pending investigation, and the entire health department would undergo federal oversight for the next 3 years. The scope of what they uncovered went beyond anything we'd imagined when my husband lit that match. 2 days later, my husband turned himself in at the courthouse for arraignment on reduced arson charges that Janice had negotiated with prosecutors. She argued successfully for release on his own recognizance, explaining how he'd risked everything to expose the corruption and save lives. Walking out of court together that afternoon felt like a small victory, even though we knew there was still a long legal road ahead. The insurance company sent their denial letter the next week, citing the arson admission as grounds to reject our claim for the restaurant and all the equipment inside. Some restaurant owners who've been following the case started a fund for us, raising about $8,000 total from small donations. Local suppliers donated another $3,000, saying they respected what we'd done to clean up the industry, even if it cost us everything. 2 months dragged by with court dates and depositions before my husband finally accepted a plea deal for reckless endangerment with a suspended sentence, 3 years probation, and 600 hours of community service. The judge set restitution at $200 a month for 5 years, which we could manage if I kept working and we stayed in the smaller rental. We could live with this outcome after everything that could have gone wrong. The judge signed protective orders against the supplier's associates the same day, legally requiring them to stay away from us and the girls. Olivia went back to violin practice, and Ava returned to soccer, though we still watched them like hawks and buried our fears about their activities. The constant dread that had controlled our lives for months started to fade into regular parental caution. We started family counseling the next week to deal with everything that had happened and figure out how to talk to the girls about why we'd moved so suddenly. The therapist helped us find age-appropriate ways to explain that Daddy had to make a hard choice to keep people safe without scaring them about the details. Healing was going to take time, but at least we were starting. 3 weeks passed before Harris stood in court wearing an orange jumpsuit while the judge read out his plea agreement for 2 years in prison and permanent loss of his inspector license. His boss got 6 months plus $30,000 in fines after the prosecutor showed evidence of him taking even bigger bribes than Harris. The courtroom was packed with restaurant owners and families who'd gotten sick from the bad meat, including Mia's parents who sat in the front row holding hands. Harris kept his head down while the judge talked about betraying public trust and putting hundreds of lives at risk for money. The supplier company got shut down by federal order the same week with executives facing their own trials that would drag on for months. The news showed footage of workers clearing out the processing plant while health officials in hazmat suits tested equipment for contamination. Most of the workers lost their jobs, which made me sad since they probably didn't know what their bosses were doing. But at least the poisoning pipeline was finally closed. Mia got released from the hospital after 4 months though. She'd need dialysis 3 times a week for the rest of her life. Her parents sent us a photo of her walking out of the hospital doors, still skinny and pale but smiling. We had to sell our house to cover the debts from the restaurant since insurance wouldn't pay anything after my husband admitted to arson. The real estate agent got us a decent price considering we needed to close fast, and we used every penny to pay off the second mortgage and credit cards. We found a small rental house near the girls' school with good locks, and a security system the landlord had already installed. The place had 2 bedrooms so the girls had to share, but they actually liked being roommates and decorated their walls with posters together. Our neighbors were mostly older couples who kept an eye on things, which made us feel safer after everything we'd been through. My husband couldn't find regular work with the arson plea on his record, but he started volunteering at a food safety nonprofit that inspected soup kitchens and food banks. They didn't pay him, but he said helping make sure poor families got safe food felt like making up for what happened. I picked up bookkeeping work I could do from home, managing accounts for 3 small businesses that didn't mind my lack of formal training. The money wasn't much, but combined with my husband's community service stipend, we could cover rent and groceries. Naomi published her follow-up story about all the new food safety rules that got passed because of our case. She kept our names out of it like she promised, but wrote about the courage it took to burn down a dream to save strangers. Reading her article at my kitchen table made tears run down my face, the good kind that come from knowing you did the right thing, even when it cost everything. She interviewed other restaurant owners who said they felt safer now, knowing inspectors couldn't take bribes without facing real consequences. Jeff's fire department created new rules about volunteer investigators having to report conflicts of interest after what happened with Harris. He mailed us a handwritten note saying he was proud of us for standing up to corruption and that his department would keep fighting for honest investigations. His support through everything, especially when he refused to let Harris push him into ruling the fire as arson without proof, meant more than he'd ever know. 5 months after the fire, we filled out applications for a cottage food permit that would let us make jams and baked goods in our home kitchen to sell at farmers markets. The permit fee was only $50 and the health requirements were basic stuff like hairnets and clean surfaces. Nothing like the massive regulations for restaurants. We bought used equipment from the restaurant supply liquidators, just basic mixers and sheet pans that fit in our regular oven. The permit got approved in 2 weeks since our kitchen passed the simple inspection without any problems. Our first farmer's market table had 12 jars of strawberry jam and 24 muffins that sold out in 3 hours. People didn't know our story, but they liked talking to us about the fruit we used and how we made everything ourselves. The profit was tiny compared to what the restaurant would have made, but it was honest money from our own hands. 6 months after the fire, We sat around our small dining table eating spaghetti with sauce I'd made from tomatoes we grew in pots on our back porch. Olivia was telling us about her science project on food preservation, while Ava showed us the goal she'd scored at soccer practice. My husband reached over and squeezed my hand while the girls laughed about something that happened at school. We'd lost our restaurant and our savings in our house, but sitting there watching our daughters smile over a simple meal we'd made ourselves, I knew we'd kept what really mattered.